Hello, Peter.
Good
Hello,
morning.
Peter. Hello?
Have you been?
Oh, I can hear you now. Yeah, good. Good to be home. Good trip, but good to be home.
Someday I want to go to Japan.
It's a fascinating place.
Were you able to see any sumo?
We
It's
did
a sport
actually
that I
see,
follow.
we did see some sumo people on the street, but we didn't see any sumo wrestling, no.
It's actually the only sport that I follow.
Oh. We did go to a baseball game, though. We went to see the Giants. So I'm just texting Mark back. He can't make it today.
Well, I'm gonna have to leave after the first hour. My mom needs me for transport.
Yeah, that's fine. Where in New York are you, by the way?
Westchester, about an hour north of New York City. Well, it's like 40 to 50 minutes by train, depending upon how fast it's running.
Is that northeast or northwest? East, right?
Straight north
Straight
on the
north.
Hudson. We're up in the hills overlooking the river.
Oh, okay. Well, that's very nice. Driven past there many, many times. Yeah, that's good.
So it probably has like an overlooking the Rhine feel for a European equivalent.
Hmm. Yeah, I should post a picture, send a picture. That would be good. Yeah, I'm not sure who's coming today. I think Fabienne is coming in. I just type in the Twitter group. Boom, see what happens. Then I'm going to load a page for you.
Hi, Fabian.
There he is.
Hello.
Hello, I'm just signing into something here. ACM Digital Library. Just going to check a thing for you. Oh, by the way, well, also for you, Peter, but primarily for you, Fabian, on the 12th of May, there's that Brave Conversations thing in Brussels.
Yeah.
I may
So,
come in for that.
I'll need to check my agenda. I didn't do that yet, but yeah, sounded pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting group of people. So I'm
And I
just
saw also you shared a link for CHI in Hamburg.
yeah, that I'm not sure about. That really comes down to who is going.
I wish I could go also, but this one is probably not going to be possible. I was going to go to the one in just before the pandemic in Hawaii to discuss about VR and other interactions. And then pandemic said you're not going anywhere, so a bit disappointed.
Yeah, that is annoying. I wanted to show you guys this. Remind me, well, don't remind me if I have, because that'll just be really hurtful. Just kidding. Anyway, I'm just downloading this fresh. It does its thing. And then I copy a bit of text. Sorry, author's not running. Make a new document. And then I paste the citation. And look, it now has the file name.
Oh, very nice.
So if I now, sorry, I'm just going to save this one as test name exports. Ignore this bit. This is just me dealing with a bug. Okay, here it is. I'm going to close this. But if I now go into this and click on this citation, I get the name and title. If I click on the title, it opens the document.
How does it open it?
I'm sorry, I think my computer audio is not working. I'm not hearing any massive cheering.
How
Cheer,
does it look?
cheer.
I'll show you. It's really ridiculously simple. So in the visual meta, of course it's visual meta.
This
It
is,
just includes the file name. That's it.
but it must know the location, not just the file name.
Yes. When the document was opened, it in Reader, I copied it to a folder called library.
Okay. It's like
That's all it is.
But if you have two files with the same file name,
I don't actually think of that as an interesting edge case. The reason for that is, so I'm going to stop sharing. It's just, actually, no, I'm going to show something else. This is what I've been working on in 2 weeks in Japan. If it happens, it happens, right? We can do things like, there are extensions of what we can do, but I'm just proving a concept of, if someone is a member of the ACM, for instance, chances are they're going to be downloading a lot of that type of documents. And journals tend to have really good naming conventions with numbers and whatnot, right? And if a friend sends another friend a document called document, that's just stupid. You know, I'm one developer. They can go further, but I think it's a very valid question. But I just don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. You know what I mean?
I mean, as a
No, you're the
prototypist,
prototypist.
100%. Yeah. But that's why I'm asking you, not me, because
Yes.
if you're building a prototype of a feature for potential user to see the interest, my question is, okay, not silly, but it's not necessarily relevant. If though at some point you plan to ship it and somebody somehow lose a precious document because it's overwritten by the other one, I mean, I'm not going to be there for handling this kind of problem, but that's a different kind of question. That's why I asked.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then the final thing to show you guys is this. Have you seen how I've implemented Ask? Oh, here's Alan.
Hey.
Hello, Alan.
Hi, Alan.
Hey, everyone.
Very, very glad you're here. I'm just showing two brief things, and then we'll get on to other things. The first one was when you make a citation now, and you click on the citation, you know, you get a little pop-up, which is really cool. That was Mark Anderson's idea. But look at this, Alan. When I click on the title of this document, it opens the original.
Very good. Wow.
I think it's such an important thing because there is quite a bit of a barrier for modern people, maybe not in the 90s, but modern people waiting for a web link to load and then having to do a download. You know, it's a thing. Anyway,
That's assuming that the link is local, right? Or
yes.
Okay.
What it does when it opens that document that you've cited the first time, it adds it to a library folder.
Okay.
So it's just super simple. But yeah, the last thing is obviously to be, what's the word? Anyway, here's the AI solutions. Number one, in Reader, control click, you get Ask AI. Should we do list main points maybe? So it uses the user's API, open API key.
Okay.
There's the solution. A key.
Wow.
Thank you. Reading and writing with AI is, of course, very different. And that's something I look forward to talking to you later in the week on the 20th, on Thursday. So here, you can't edit these. You can basically, so all of these are prefaces that will go before the selected text when it's sent to OpenAI. So these are very focused around reading. You know, if you want to make something specific to your field, you can, but you know, if someone has an example of so-and-so, you can instantly get a counterexample. But what we've also done is added it to Liquid. So I can be anywhere. I happen to be in the same Reader thing. So I did the keyboard shortcut to launch Liquid, and here I have also Ask AI. So now I can do summarize in a sentence. This is alpha. This doesn't always work, but it worked this time. So let's see. Okay, so here is Mark Anderson sent the text. He can't be here today, so I'm going to do make more academic, just to be annoying. Yeah, here you can also edit your things, but that didn't actually render, did it? Look at this. So that's Mark's text written. It's actually interesting, isn't it? Nevertheless, a steep learning curve can serve to stimulate cognitive activity. And Mark said, well, nothing like a vertical learning curve to keep the mind active. So there we go. Hi, David.
Hi, how are you all?
It's a good question. How are we all? I'm good. Everyone else good?
Good to see you all.
I had a brief meeting with Fabian and Mark when I was in Tokyo with full headsetting experience. We used the Meta Horizon workroom, and you know, we looked like cartoon characters, but it was quite impressive, wasn't it, Fabian? It was quite impressive, wasn't it, Fabian?
No,
What do you mean, no?
I mean, it wasn't impressive to me. It was interesting, and we had an interesting discussion, and we tried some of the features. But I tried that a while ago, and I'm not impressed by it anymore. Maybe I wasn't, to be honest, a year ago. I think it opens up some new avenues for collaboration, programming, reading, even discussing, building things. But I personally was not impressed. Sorry.
I guess it depends what we're talking about, because first of all, who here has tried it? The Horizon Workroom VR meeting experience. Okay, I'll just briefly explain what it is, because Fabian and I completely agree on this, but we're just talking about two different aspects. So you put your headset on, you enter the room, and you can sit in a chair or stand by the whiteboard. That's all you can. You cannot walk around. So you are modeled with whatever avatar you want. And if you use the Pro, it models your facial movements and your eyes and all that stuff. So you look kind of cartoony rendered, but good. And wherever you're sitting around the table, the key thing is that the sound of the other people will come from their seats. So it has a really good sense of space. You feel you're in a room with someone. So on that level, it's hugely impressive. But I think what Fabian, just to be talking your words, what is not impressive is you cannot hardly do anything in there. You know, it is a very early CD-ROM demo type thing that does one thing extremely well. And if you've done it for 5 minutes, then still technically impressive, but not useful beyond the basics.
I don't find it technically impressive because the spatial audio, it is useful and especially like to split groups and all that. But I, as a single developer, implemented that also. So it's not hard to do. Like you don't need actual $1 billion of R&D to do this. So I'm sorry to insist, but I don't find it impressive. I find it impressive if we try something, not just a product, but what doesn't actually matter. That I try it, I'm like, shit, I don't actually know how to do this. And if I know how to do this, it's unreachable for me. And this did not feel that way. It feels like most of the feature, yes, the implementation I have is nowhere near as sleek, performant, and all this, but the core of it, including spatial audio, I, as a single developer in 2023, can do this in a couple of days, and I have that already and done that in the past. So with that, again, I'm not impressed.
Okay, absolutely fair enough. I mean, the thing is, so much of this stuff is magic now. Like the first time I put on the Quest 2, the way that it did the room mapping to make sure that the floor was the floor and everything was completely solid seeming was absolute magic. But I do agree with you, obviously, that in terms of interactions. But maybe we should talk a little bit about what we're doing on the 20th, talking about our discussion for Thursday, because there is so much hype for text and AI, and then there's also so much doom mongering. Doom mongering is great. A lot of people are doing it very well, including Jaron Lanier. But I think we should, as a kind of a developer thinking, not that we're all developer, but developer thinking and community, think about how can we make it amazing? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important right now because there's no way that this thing is going to get paused or stopped that's just that whole idea with that letter is it's a non-starter. The cat's out of the bag, the train's left the station. So we have a choice whether we want to either ignore it and kind of let it pass us by and maybe have people who have malintentions be the primary users, or we can embrace it and think about how it can really be a transformative moment. I mean, it's going to be a transformative moment regardless. I just think that what you're talking about is so right on, and in terms of really shifting the narrative about how we should think about AI, because it's going to happen. So we might as well make the best of it, right? And that's what I think you're calling on us to do.
Yeah. I mean, one really basic thing about AI is, of course, the different levels of AI, which haven't really been uniformly described. But, people are talking about when something becomes a product, it's no longer AI, it's just a feature. When we were in Japan last week, it took us a full week to realize that our watches can translate. So when we were talking to the family, very often I would just say, translate to Japanese, how are you today?
In Japanese, how are you today is 今日はお元気ですか?
That's magic. And that's useful. That's AI or machine learning or whatever title. My point of it is, it takes even me, who is interested in this stuff and thinks about it, took me a long time to realize, hang on, because that's a capability I can use. So to go to the further levels of prompts and templates and all that stuff is going to require a lot of deep thinking to even know that it can be done, right?
It's interesting, the example of the watch, because it is also, I forgot which example I used a couple of weeks ago, but yeah, we have all those gadgets, including Workroom or Horizon and whatnot, and yet we're still so stuck in our ways. Even aficionados, experts, enthusiasts, and professionals like us, we still do things the way we did before, and it takes us time to do it another way. Even if it was, and I'm not saying it is, but even when it's objectively better, we still get stuck in the tradition.
Yeah, and another thing that was really shocking to me was right before the trip, I bought the iPhone 14 Pro, and the video quality on that tiny thing is depending. Okay, it doesn't have the optics and stuff. If you want to have blurry backgrounds and whatever, it tries to do it computationally and it does a meh job. But the quality of that is at least as good as the most expensive video camera just a couple of years ago. And it is an absolute quantum leap in what can be done. So I made an 1.5-hour video of our trip, just for family and friends for the future. But it's 4K, 60 frames a second, generally good color. To even learn how to use that, let alone all the other things, just to know you have a tool that is insanely good, and in a year it's going to be twice as good as. So yeah, Peter and Alan, you haven't talked to me about writing, education, AI, and make our heads spin. Or if you want to wait, maybe Fabian wants to talk about the link he posted, whichever way. Alan, you look like you're ready, actually. I'll shush.
No, I mean, I'm looking forward to the talk on Thursday. I've yet to see if I can go to it, but I plan to go to it. I think that there's as usual, whenever you have something that's so quickly emerging like this, we don't have the right words to talk about it yet, right? So
Yes.
all the GPT, the transformer based, the large language models innovations, it's funny that when we interact with it, we say that we are, working with AI or working with ML. Like that's one example where I think it would be more clear to say these are like cognitive services, or this is something like it is AI behind, under the hood, right? But we're not making the engine, we're just driving the car, right? And there's other AI in that big envelope of AI where it's like, okay, I've got to go figure out a model, I've got to take the data and analyze it, so it's the fact that we're having this pre-cooked version of AI is different than all of the other things. It doesn't make it less, it just means that the way that we're interfacing with it is different, right? And it's definitely consumer level machine learning, which is mind-blowing, all the stuff that's happened in the last 5 months. So the language, that's just one example where the language could get a little more nuanced. I am excited to see where the limitations are. I think one of the best analogies I've heard is from Venkatesh Rao, who suggested that maybe the better way to think about intelligence is the way that we think about flight now. Before humans could fly, we just had birds and other things that could fly, and it was like, oh, they have this magical flight. I want that, right? And we imitated the birds for a little bit, but once we understood some of the core ideas, we made our own flight, so we don't confuse the way birds fly and say we fly like birds. We understand that there are two things that are called flight, and they're totally different from each other, but they share some of the same principles. And Venkatesh Rao was saying maybe that's how we could think about intelligence. We have this natural intelligence, and now it seems that machines will have this other kind of intelligence, and there may be principles behind the two that are strikingly similar, because that's what we're starting to see in these surprising results that are either smoke and mirrors, or just hyper enthusiasm, or an actual evidence of some kind of connective tissue that means that would mean that a reasoner, something can be reasoned without a reasoner, in the traditional sense. So I like that analogy. I'm looking forward to more conversations that flesh it out, that aren't necessarily charged with good or bad. I mean, ethics is critical to the conversation, but we also have to be pretty dispassionate about understanding what's going on. And then finally, I guess, I think I'm really optimistic about the next 10 years. I think that there is going to be a lot of people holding on to the way things are. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, still, writing on paper is still the best. But I kind of, as an example, I kind of think at times that like what we call UI now, or conventional UI patterns, drop-down menus, things like that, are currently still critical as a way to get the information that we need. But it may be pretty soon that they're almost like the automata from the 18th century, little mechanical tinkerings, fun gadgets that are still cool to have on a site or an app, but they're no longer really necessary because you have this other way to get the information. That said, I think that there's still a lot missing to the simple input output that we see in prompt engineering or in the ChatGPT. And I'd love to see things that are closer to creating a composition. You can imagine making a graph, knowledge graph, or even a drawing of ideas where things are below other things that kind of looped inside, and then tell GPT, turn this into an essay, not just as a single prompt, but something that has cadence, something that could hit a point 3 minutes in. That's my long spiel.
Other than that's my launch feel at the end of that transcript. That was a pretty good transcription. We need a way to capture things like what you say better. We should look at the apps here, but I think that was really wonderful. The terminology is important. And can you do a 5 minutes on this on Thursday?
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll be on first because we do need to question that. In my own little thesis, going through the corrections and all that stuff now, an issue is the word metadata, which is just a useless term. My examiner said that some of the data that Visual Meta uses isn't what we normally would call metadata. My reply is, who cares? It's useful data. And that was a very useful conversation. So, similarly, we do need to look at the language we have around AI. I think the birds analogy, the flying analogy, is very, very apt. Yeah, so thanks for that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that I'm going to submit very shortly a one-pager perspective, and the way I'm really thinking about it is that it's important for us to start thinking about the digital environments that we're creating and making them safe, prioritizing safety and collaboration, really. So I'm looking at the academia through that lens as well. So how do we create a safe digital environment for academia that enables AI to be used in really positive ways, but also creates safety? And so that's what I'm thinking about. I will send you something on that later today, and if there is space to do a 5-minute talk around creating safe digital spaces for academia, that would be great as well.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So I look forward to having that presentation on Thursday as well. Fabian, do you want to talk about what the link?
Sure, it's a little bit off topic, but happy to do that. It's basically, I forgot I had an argument on Reddit yesterday about the Quest Pro versus another headset. And the Quest Pro, beside all the meta stuff, the bad thing about it, let's say it's all standalone, so it's very convenient, but if you need like a huge graph or a huge text or something like big 3D model, that stuff is not good enough, basically. But if you have a desktop, of course, you can use the power of the desktop. The problem was, at least I thought, was that you needed an API from Facebook, which would only work with Windows. But there is a tool called ALVR for AirLink VR, which allows you to use, if you have a fast Wi-Fi, like Wi-Fi 5 or 6, to do the rendering on the desktop, and then to see the result in the VR headset. So if you have, for example, big VR games or 3D models or whatnot, but you still want to use this because the optics are pretty good and it's still super convenient. You don't need like base stations, you don't need whatnot. You can still use this, so it's a pretty good tool. But yeah, I was positively shocked that it works on Linux, so I can still use an open source system. And it also was point and clicks for 2 minutes, not like compiling libraries and getting like a dependency hell. So now I'm able to have a still very good haptics and convenience, but with a much more powerful GPU. So that was what the link was about. So I think it's honestly it's an impressive compromise because you have your desktop performance and you still have your standalone, so that if you just like go for a coffee or take the plane or whatnot, then you just take the standalone headset and you can still have a low resolution version. So I think it's a good solution.
Not supported on Mac, unfortunately, but that's kind of normal.
I think it's tricky for the GPU. That's the problem.
So this is really cool. It makes me wonder, though. The rumor for Apple's reality headset, stupid name, is that it will have a battery pack that attaches to your belt. I
Yeah.
have a feeling that must be an optional accessory. Like the Quest Pro, it only has about an hour of battery, and then you can power it through a cable. Because with the M2 and 3 and whatever chips coming out, I'm sure they will probably also allow for offloading of processing to the devices, to the Macs or something. So anyway, just a little thought.
They should. But then they were you remember the mouse with the charging under. So I'm very much in wait and see mode. A colleague also came, I think on Friday in my office, making a joke like, "Oh, did you see the Apple headset is out?" And I was like, "What?" And I was assuming he was looking at my rumor, but I still checked, and I still saw a bunch of different rumors, and I'm again wait and see mode. So it will be there when it will be there. As long as we keep on learning before and after, I'm fine with it. I can show something also briefly. I'll share my screen and please let me know when you see it. Do you see something?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know if you're familiar. So that's my office. And this you should be familiar with. It looks a bit like a 360 photo. A very blurry one, but still. But what should be strange to most of you is that, well, first the color changed a bit when I turn around, so that's a hint. But then I can translate. So move a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. And I can zoom in and out up to a certain point. So I can move inside the 3D space. A bit as if it was a 3D model.
Is this a LiDAR scan?
No, it's done with my 360 camera, but with a normal camera, with a normal video that works just the same. I can show you
Is it one spherical image, or have you taken more than one?
So it's a spherical video, and if I see the behind the scene, it cuts them in 8 perspective per frame. And it roughly invert or try to guess the path I took with a 360. So I started here and then walked around and a kind of loop there. And the program, without any sensor, so no depth camera, no IMU, just from the images, basically invert the position and then reconstruct it as a 3D, not really a 3D model, but a 3D scene at least.
Which camera is it?
It's a Ricoh Theta.
Okay. Yeah, this stuff is just really, really interesting. When you see technologies competing, like LiDAR is competing with this and also with photogrammetry and all of these different types of things. It's fun and useful. One thing that I'm really surprised with the whole commercial Quest thing is, oh, by the way, can you share a screen? Again, I just want to see our video cameras because I just want to check the one I'm using, if you don't mind. So can you go back to us? As in go back to, yeah. See, on my screen, my video looks a lot better. But here it looks about the same. So I guess the compressions are what happens, right?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Just wondering about that.
You're welcome. Oh, and so, sorry, just also to finish on the nerve thing. As you might have guessed from my constant, not whining, but It's all open source. So the entire tool chain, everything can be inspected, modified, automatized, so that, for example, you go from a video or an image or a series of image or point of view, you send it to your server, your desktop, whatever you want, you get a 3D model. And then an experiment I did last week was doing this, but instead of a room was a book. And then you can grab the book and manipulate it. Not high resolution, because honestly, I wanted like quick and dirty. Actually, I wanted quick and clean, but that's not possible. So I got quick and dirty, and that was enough to prove the point. But you can imagine an entire workflow where everything is automatized without going through the cloud, without any big provider. And you get your object, you take a normal video of it about the right way, and a couple of minutes later, in the headset, then you get the 3D model of it. And then you can start to interact. You can share that model to your friends or colleagues, again, in a matter of minutes.
It's kind of funny how these buzz phases go through and everything else becomes really boring. It's like fashion, how VR is dead in the media now. It's all about AI, but clearly they are going to be developing in parallel. And clearly it'll be very, very exciting when they both mature a little bit. And equally clear, the kind of things you're talking about now is stuff we should probably get into volume 4 of the book. You know, we've spent a year as a community, and, you know, this community, obviously, this is not the only community everyone's part of, but it's so important to write these things down. I really do think that when, you know, Apple will be commercially successful, there's no question about it. It'll take them a few years. They'll mess up like they always do, and then they'll find their feet and they will own the interactions. A lot of the stuff you just talked about, it has to be, you know, I don't know if you saw on the screen here when I was sharing my screen. So Mark Anderson, he's not here today because he's writing a bit of a history of hypertext for the Hypertext Conference. And he's pointing out how much of the history is missing. And it's so important to be able to go and read the early papers quite simply for inspiration, I think. So we are the old time for people in the future. You know, our ignorance and our naivete is gold dust for people in the future who has grown up with headsets and grown up with advanced AI. They're going to just be, you know, buying it and using it. So yeah, sorry. At least once a week I have to say that.
A little remark also about for people in the future. There was an interesting, it wasn't an article, it was just like a short blog post by, I'll look up the link on Twitter, but from a researcher in privacy and AI from Princeton, professor, I think, who used ChatGPT for his 3-year-old kid, I think daughter. And so first, it's an interesting article. It's an interesting process and an article. But what to me was especially interesting is because this person's job is artificial intelligence, understanding how it works, what are the limits, what are the risks for society, all this. He still does share his experiment with his own kid. What's interesting is because if there is one thing that people can be, I don't know, not hurt, but mindful about is giving advice on how to raise other people's kid. And then if you put this on social media, you can imagine the amount of gentle suggestion from others, like basically, you should raise your kid like this. You should raise your kid like that. He still shared it. And what was the most interesting part for me was that he said he was surprised because ChatGPT was basically mindful of his kid's age. He did say, oh, my kid is a 3-year-old. Can you please explain? Or I think he let his kid ask something, what happens when you turn the light off? And to me, that was the interesting part, that a researcher, an expert in the field, a professor, was surprised that the ChatGPT, the large language model, did exactly what he wanted. Like he asked the model to address the person as a kid, and the model did. And I think that's quite interesting because it shows that even an expert, when it's, I guess, an emotional moment, not like writing about something in the abstract, but living the thing, still get fooled because in the end, he knows it's a bunch of algorithm, input, output, bunch of words. There is no meaning. It's just invented or thought through from by the reader and himself giving meaning to it. And he was still surprised. So I think that was fascinating.
Yeah, interesting. Somebody said, don't ask AI to think, ask it to do. Which obviously it's a bit of an easy thing to say, but it's really fascinating when you say it in context of that.
Okay, I guess it's my turn now.
Oh, yes, please. Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all of the AI systems that they're currently pushing. I really see them more as a search tool than anything else. What you're doing is you're taking a look at tens of thousands of documents, predicting next word probabilities for them, and building a model by clustering things in a higher dimensional space. But it's so heavily dependent upon what the original training data was. Now, the megacorps love this because they have terabytes of training data and the CPU resources to be able to grind away at it to build up these models. But there really is no modeling of the underlying substance of what these models are generating. I had it spit out non-existent academic citations for me. It cited Mark Bernstein as having written a paper that he never ever wrote on a subject that was a plausible subject for him to have written on, but it was basically asserting that he drew conclusions that were totally off the wall from his entire body of writing because the language it was generating was probably based upon having seen dozens of ACM papers. So the quality of the underlying knowledge coming out of it is abysmal. And I dread the thought of students flooding their professors with essays that they've used this technology to generate, because the sheer amount of time to go and fact checking them would make grading them utterly impossible if the only model is show me your result and I'll try to figure out whether it was a good paper or not. What they are really good for is more of creative writing kinds of applications. I found that the AI has a real affinity for H.P. Lovecraft and can spit out absolutely marvelous cosmic horror texts as long as it doesn't go too far and start cycling back on itself. But if you stay within its token window of how much context it can keep in its own memory, it can produce very plausible descriptions of rooms, environments, up to a few paragraphs again before it starts to run off the rails. So as a creative writing seed tool, it's really potentially effective. But anything that's dependent upon fact, you run into trouble. It can
hang on, Peter.
Yeah.
Because you're kind of going back to the beginning point. I think you may want to paraphrase that. When you're talking about facts, the issue with the Mark Bernstein paper is if you ask it to do something academic, it's going to produce something that looks academic. Yes, it will produce fake citations because that's what it expects you to want. So that is why it's so important to, like Alan was talking about earlier, to know what kind of flight you're getting on. First of all, to use AI to write a paper, I think is the most absurdly stupid idea in the world, apart from creative writing, like you just said. Then it's kind of fun. But if you're trying more academic or human-to-human communication rather than something creative, and this is not me disagreeing with you, this is just trying to frame things. We have to find more intelligent ways to use it.
Yeah, so that's where I think the answer from the faculty perspective would be, don't tell the students that they can't use the tool, because they're going to use the tool and lie to you. I think the way to do it is, we want you to use the tool, but explain how you've integrated it into your process and show how you backstopped any assertions that the tool is spitting out to you to make sure that they're really grounded in substance and they're not just plausible generalizations based upon what the system's seen. Another troubling issue is just general overall bias that's present in material that's available on the web versus all material and all potential perspectives on an issue. It would be very easy to get into pockets of political bias where the system might not see possible alternatives because the general consensus and milieu on the internet is looking at one area of the search space, and there could be a lot of other possibilities, but if they're not something that's been talked about in a large number of sources that the model has been trained on, the model is going to be unlikely to get some unless you put a real hot temperature and tell it to be really creative, but then it's going to be throwing out so much pure fictional stuff that it'll be hard to separate the wheat from the chaff. So that's an issue. I know some people like trying to train them to bias them for alternate pockets of bias, since the general internet community is probably somewhat more liberal possibly than the general population. There'll be a certain shift in the perception of what the AI consensus of reality is versus what ground truth would be if we had access to everything, including things that aren't currently digitized. So we have a lot to think about there. And of course, from, again, the paper writing perspective, I really like the literate programming model where you write the essay about how you're writing the essay in addition to the essay. So that you can get basically the meta level content of what your research was in addition to the final output level. And that would really prevent people from just turning the system loose and submitting work that they hadn't contributed a significant amount to. Oh, there were also some very interesting things coming up now on the US Patent Office refusing to copyright material that was generated by AI. And then some of the people using the tools have come back at the Patent Office, Patent and Trademark Office, saying, well, wait a minute, we should be able to copyright this because, yes, this graphic was produced by the AI, but, you know, I spent 6 days trying different prompts with it and rejecting vast numbers of generated output images until I came up with the image that actually matched what I wanted. So I should be able to copyright it. And that's going to be a real big, raging, deep legal debate. And I think it's going to come down eventually to a question of fact for a jury to take a look and decide whether you really did enough engagement with the tool so that the result of you plus the tool should be worthy of copyright. A bright line thing of if you use that tool, it's no good. Well, then where do you draw the line in the other direction? Couldn't someone just as easily argue that you can't draw well freehand, but if you used a draw app to produce your nice straight lines and all, you shouldn't be able to copyright it because there was an app that figured out where those coordinates should be and drew those lines for you.
I had a discussion with someone this morning on that, well, very parallel, which was, I saw on Facebook that someone said, oh, so exciting, I was in this place and I borrowed a friend's Leica camera and the pictures look really, really good. And, you know, it was a little back and forth, how nice, blah, 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 what model was it, that kind of talk. And then one of my friends, a very, very intelligent person, close friend, said she doesn't believe that photography is about the equipment. And that was very interesting because it relates to what you're saying. For me, half a photograph is the subject. The other half is the lighting, the texture, the bokeh, what the lens contributes, all that stuff. So if you take a picture with an early iPhone, or if you take a picture with a massive medium format camera, to me, artistically, those are very different things because there is a contribution by the equipment. And the reason I say it kind of mirrors a little bit what you're talking about is because, you know, what does a photographer do? They click a button. The people who made the camera, should they own copyright to all the pictures because they put in a much more effort than the photographer who just pressed a button? It sounds like it's a provocative analog.
Indeed.
A couple of comments on that. Wide ranging, a lot of good stuff, and largely agree. It would be interesting to gather a bunch of claims together and sort of sort them and into bets along the lines of what are things that won't change over time and what are things that will, right? So for instance, we're talking a lot about large language models and the way that they operate, and that's exciting, but it's definitely not. I mean, it's just one peg on this journey, and so far the journey's been amping up. You know, like what's going to come after transformers? There's definitely going to be something. There's obviously limitations of large language models. It's not the end all be all. Maybe the next thing will be some idea of a meta token. You know, some sort of token qualia, right? Which gets close to ontology tracing, which is kind of like what Marvin Minsky was trying to do at the beginning of it all. There are going to be different approaches, and they're all going to do different things well. So it's useful and good to talk about, you know, here's what this is best at. But it's at times going so far to say this is what it can't do. We have to make sure that, are we talking just about large language models, or are we talking about ML in general? And I'm certainly not on the side to say that ML can do all things. I'm actually very suspicious of it in the way that I'm suspicious of, you know, government in a lot of ways. You know, anytime that you automate something, you're going to pave over. Anytime you make an interstate, you're going to pave over neighborhoods at some point. That's mainly me reading the Power Broker, so that's where that's coming from. But there are things where automation will never really be able to do well, and there's a lot that large language models is tied to, very similar to automation. Specifically, the point of corpora, or sucking in all of these multiple corpuses of text, has the flip side, the double-edged sword, however that phrase goes, of limiting its knowledge to legacy formats, legacy ways of thinking, right? So if we suddenly moved into a virtual reality world, like, I don't know, there was some sort of bomb that went off and blew up all the internet and blew up all paper, and now the only thing that we could do is use our hands and gestures and motion inside a virtual space to transmit ideas. The AI wouldn't be useful for like 30 years, right? It's the brute force work of all of the stuff that's already been on the internet that's helped it get to this point. And so, yeah, I Peter, I agree with a lot of what you're saying there, and I don't think I disagree with any of it. But it's important to maybe decompose some of the forces at play. You know, there are forces around what is copyright protection, what is genuine and actual. Then there's the other forces of what can this technology actually do, what are its limitations, what are its limitations this month versus next month. The thing, when I said earlier that I'm optimistic about and excited about, is that I do think going to I don't think anybody's really processed how GPT is going to affect how we write and how we read in particular. And I'm really, really excited about that. Anyway, that's just a flood of thoughts from what I heard. Sorry, I missed a bunch of it. Yeah, go ahead.
So, as you all know, I tell you many times, I'm finishing my thesis, maybe, trying to do corrections. And a lot of it is truly bullshit. A lot of it is make this sound more academic. A lot of it is add some stuff here. And I've talked to my advisors about this and with the whole AI revolution, and they don't want to talk to me while I'm in process, so to speak, but they are saying that academia will have to change. And I think we'll have to write more hypertextually and less wordy. one of the hardest things in actual thinking is clarity, right? I mean, Yuval Noah Harari, he writes that he meditates twice a day for 2 hours. No, sorry, once a day for 2 hours. And it is to achieve clarity. I don't meditate much, so this is not about meditation, but he uses the term clarity. And when you are trying to learn something, you're trying to achieve clarity in an area. But for some reason, academia is not about clarity. It is about prestige and sounding cool. You know, I have a problem with my thesis because I can explain it in 20 seconds, right? There's so much that has to change culturally. When anybody can use an AI to do something, even if we ignore the issue that is valid, Peter, of fake citations, even if we have a ChatGPT or similar interface where we say, using no fake citations, I will add them later through a separate mechanism, write a 30-page piece on so-and-so based on this and that. Even if it's a really interesting prompt, who the hell benefits? There is no intellectual benefit for anybody, other than maybe as an inspiration, as you said, Peter, I agree with it also, an inspiration for some kind of creative writing task. So we have to change what it is. I mean, Chris Gutteridge, colleague at the University of Southampton, he studied for a PhD many years ago and gave up on it. It wasn't for him. And he is a ridiculously intelligent person. It just wasn't his mode of thought. But one thing he did discover in this research was most of what a paper is about, you can find by reading the last sentence of the abstract. You know, in the abstract is where the author feels they can actually say what it is. The last sentence is the key thing. It's ridiculous. It basically almost always works. So I'm trying to bring that into Reader as a feature. But what I'm saying here is we need to reinvent writing, because anytime somebody is good at something, they will want to go to the next level. If someone is good at being an academic, they will be wanting to be more academic-y. Not necessarily more well-informed or a better teacher, right? If someone is good at singing, they're going to do many la-la-las, not necessarily a song someone else will like, etc. Right? We all do that in whatever field. To a certain level, we just improve what the thing is, not necessarily how it connects to the rest of the world, right? So now I'm going to connect that to Fabienne.
I'm wondering, when you say this, it's something I hope at least that most of us do, meaning that we go through their abstracts, we skim through to see if it makes sense, and even if somebody recommended us a paper, none of us has enough unlimited time, so we need to double check that either we know too much about it, or we don't know enough, or it doesn't make sense, and we need to dig somewhere else first. And indeed, there were not shortcuts, but pretty repeated patterns that help us. And some bad habits, let's say, some skipping through the experimental protocol, this kind of things. But I'm wondering to repeat a bit what you said about as soon as Apple is going to release the headset, then they're going to own the interaction. Most people, not to say everybody, but most people are going to stick to it. I'm wondering what's the equivalent of ChatGPT or large language model for writing? Is it going to make people, I don't know, lazy in some way, in bad ways? Because, for example, I think a lot of people use ChatGPT to summarize, whereas indeed the introduction or the executive summary, I mean, as Bob would say, if you don't necessarily need to summarize if the structure, the table of content, everything is properly done, because that should already answer most. Then you need to navigate to the right place for your query or your inquiry. But I'm wondering how many of us, how many of everybody is going to use ChatGPT or large language model to think by the default way, repeating what everybody's doing, whereas there already are some structures in place. So I'm wondering, is ChatGPT going to own some of the interaction with text, making us eventually lazy, and not necessarily again, in justified way, because there are good techniques like this, like the last sentence of the abstract with the introduction.
I'm really personally very interested in that. Like, so to go back to where you started, Fabian, about, I assume that people, skim the white paper or whatever, you look at the index and everything, and you might be right on that, but it's also kind of surprising how many people don't. I've been reading this lately, and quite enjoying it. And it actually had me thinking a lot about future of text, right? Because early on, he's saying like the value of not just skimming and looking at the table of contents, but also looking back at the index, seeing the words that are used, right? And then maybe sort of randomly picking out a bit in the book and kind of getting the vibe of it, right? Kind of like a beat cop walking around the neighborhood, trying to get a sense of what's this neighborhood about, right? And I got to the index, and it's just this list in alphabetical order, and I'm thinking how ridiculously unhelpful that is. It's helpful in a dictionary, but I want to see when Andrew Marvell was brought up, how close is that a relation to Alexander Pope that's on the next page, right? So I got to thinking about the graphs that are in Reader and Author, and how like, why aren't there graphs as just a part of all PDFs or a part of printed books? And graphs doesn't even have to be the right word, but a clustering of associations. Here's what you can expect to find in the next 30 pages. Here you can expect to find overview, like, and then a book has evolved to handle a lot of that, but a lot of that is stripped away in the ebook format, right? And so this is the main point that I'm kind of getting to. We have 50 years of technology that has actually sort of gone away from our intuition, or these longer crafts that have helped our sense of periphery and our ability to look at this different scale. And we're stuck. Like, in a way, a book is a lot like a gun, in that it can be like a religious object that can't be changed or improved on, right? Like a gun, the only way you can improve a gun is if it shoots harder or faster or more accurately, right? That's what a gun is. And a book is like the same thing. Like we seem to be unable to rethink what it could be. That's a troubled analogy. I'll put that aside for now. But what I hope is that ChatGPT will kind of break open our models, our current legacy models of how we think about this stuff. Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you put that one aside. That's a bit problematic. I think, by the way, hi, Brandel. We're trying to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about on Thursday, which is AI and writing and reading and academia and stuff. And Alan was talking about different ways of reading a document and what things should be in there. This was based on what I think was right before you came in. A friend of mine, Chris Gutteridge, he figured out that you can understand most of what an academic paper is by reading the last sentence of the abstract. That seems to be the sentence where they put what they really mean. So I'm going to try to build that as a feature, but Alan then expanded upon that. So I think what you're talking about there, Alan, is also context awareness. So yesterday, Edgar was not well. And I was sitting down here working early in the morning, and I heard Emily say, Frode, come up. And when you have a child and you hear that sentence, even in relatively neutral terms, it's the most horrifying effing thing ever. It's really weird. It's like, is it just a nothing? Is it a stomach bug? Is it a being or something? Your mind races like crazy, right? And any other time my wife would say, Frode, come here, it would be a very positive thing. And we all know about this. I'm not teaching you anything here, obviously. I'm just highlighting the fact that when people say something in an academic document, how do you get the real context for that? Are they praising someone, or are they being spiteful? Like standing on the shoulders of giants, when that was used, it was basically a bit of a joke, right? But that's not how it comes down later. how can we imbue context better, and how can we find it out later better? And Brandel, thanks for coming in at this point, because one of the things we've been talking about is using AI stuff to write an essay for us doesn't really help anyone, and there's going to be a lot of nonsense in it. So how can we change the language? This is what Alan was talking about in the beginning, not just use the simple term AI, but one of the examples he referred to was before flights that humans could do, flying was just bird flight. Now we have many different understandings of what it means to fly. We need to expand the vocabulary for what different kinds of AIs can do for us. And the really important thing I think we need to do is change writing towards clarity. We all have an intent when we write something. We intend to communicate something. How can these systems help us with that? And how can we help the reader critically understand what that intent was? Over to Fabienne.
So it's going to be much more basic than this, but it was on the weekend. Sometime at some point, let's say we go with or without tools. We go through the abstract, the introduction. We see it's actually a relevant article or paper, whatnot. We know it's going to take a while to read it, and we're on the move. And I end up doing like this, thumb up and down to scroll and scroll and scroll. For this on the desktop, I wrote a little snippet for the browser, so it just scrolls automatically. I don't have to use the mouse wheel, and it forces me to be focused, because if I'm not in the moment, then end of the paragraph, I'm like, what happened? I don't know what's there. I'll briefly share the screen, but basically I did a version for mobile phone. I don't know if you can, let me know if you can see the screen. Up. And can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And it's through the browser, no app to install, little button to do it faster, slower, etc. So there is no AI there. I wrote the code the old school way, meaning with my little hands on it. Actually, not on a keyboard. That's the funny part, and that's why I mentioned it. It's because I wrote the code on the mobile phone itself. So I was on my phone writing the code, and so that I can reshape the way I read on mobile, on my bed. You don't need to know the detail. It was the weekend, lazy, I guess. But I was still coding so that I can read hopefully better, maybe even faster. And I thought it's not the most convenient way, but somehow it worked. I was able even to share it back on Twitter. And I've done all this with my thumb. I think maybe I typed with two hands, I don't remember, but on this tiny piece of, on this tiny slab of glass and plastic and electronics. And I thought, despite all the AI hype at the moment, that was pretty amazing to be able to have high quality content, being text, some images, all that, but also being able to shape it back through just that. And I thought, yeah, that was quite an amazing moment, because there is no even, it's a computer, but it's like a tiny computer that fits in my pocket, and to be able to reshape it this way. So that was just a quick, small example, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to read more in the subway and elsewhere, just because I have this little utils that's been done not on the move, but without any assistance. So just a tiny example of a little old school kind of thing that doesn't necessarily need AI, but might shape or change a bit the way or the way at least I read.
Yeah, there's definitely, and also there's the text kind of blinking scrolling system. Yeah, no, that's definitely something to look at. Peter.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to leave in a couple minutes, but I wanted to do a quick mini demo for you of what I've been working on last couple weeks. So if I could share my screen real quick.
Yeah, please.
Okay, can you see it?
Can.
All right. Basically, what I did was I built a command line terminal widget for use in the browser or in web-based apps. And I have that tied to a Cytoscape graph visualization. So we have a command history here. If we enter something that it doesn't know, you'll say it's an unrecognized command, and we can use the up and down arrows to cycle through previously issued commands. And let's say we want to add a node to the graph. There it is. And let's add B. Now we have 2 nodes in the graph. Add C. Maybe we don't like how they're laid out, so we can just shake it up a little bit and it will redo the layout. Now let's link C to B. Okay. Seems to be trying to spell check me. All righty. Link C to B. So you get the idea. We can type in to link nodes together. We can add new nodes by command. It'll draw the arrows and it can shake up the graph. And the code do that just sort of like a generic read, evaluate, print loop that we have over here. And again, we add commands and then we tie them in to the API for the graph visualization. The nice thing about Cytoscape is it also has built-in functionality to be able to go in and work out paths between given nodes, so it can figure out if there's a series of links that will connect one node to another. And it can also find all of the nodes that are pointing into a given node and basically give you a transitive closure on the graph. And I want to use this in working with grammar development so that I can capture the relationships between different productions inside of a grammar. And then I can have a grammar production mover, which will have 2 grammars side by side and the ability to grab a rule from one and drag it into another one. And by using this functionality, pull along all of the rules that the rule that I'm dragging over from one grammar to another are dependent on. So I'll be able to get the whole dependency of subgrammars from one grammar moved into another one. And that should help with some more sophisticated work with text.
When you say grammar, what do you mean by grammar in this context?
In this context, I'm talking parsing expression grammars that can be used to recognize arbitrary language structures.
It's nice to see the left-hand side of the screen like this.
So that's how the system operates. And again, it has some nice. See, what happened was I was having to have the JavaScript console open all the time, and that was getting to be annoying. And this way, it's part of the main visualization, and it's a little bit more attractive to look at. I have the core functionality that I want. And again, we have just basically this is just like a generic framework. Any code manipulating anything could be using the terminal component over here in it. And there's sort of like a layer of tooling that will help. Also, I spent a fair amount of time debating between whether to use Electron or Tauri or Neutralino.js. I'm now leaning to Neutralino.js. It seemed to have a few less bugs and as a built-in file watcher I haven't tried out yet, but if it works, that will again help in automating tooling. And oh, best of all, its executables it produces are much smaller, like 2.8 meg files as opposed to 300 plus meg files for Electron applications. And the reason it does that is instead of trying to embed Node and Chrome inside of the system, it's just relying on existing Apple or Windows level libraries that provide JavaScript interpreters and web views. So it's using native components. So it's not having to pull along half of the internet just to write a small hello world.
Yeah, that's useful. Very cool. Anyone have any questions or comments before we go over to Randall?
I also really recommend Cytoscape. You can indeed do just display of nodes, but finding if nodes are connected, finding if the graph is complete, some like centrality between nodes. It's a really powerful tool in JavaScript and large graphs too.
Okay, I'm gonna have to duck out now to provide transport for Mom, and I'll see you on Thursday.
Yeah, look forward. Thanks,
And it's the
Peter.
regular time, right?
Yes, same time.
Okay, same bat time, same bat channel.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Let's see what happens to your screen.
And let's see, stop sharing. There we go, and heading out. Bye, guys.
See you later.
Interesting that
Yeah,
the
Brendel, sorry.
the use of shadow planes in there, just to imply what is sort of a surface, what's in a surface, and what's on a surface. The way that the inspector is kind of presented as though it's an instrument on top of this machine that has a thing inside it. I don't know if that's an intentional thing on his part, but it's an interesting thing to think about in the context where there are more, shall we say, intrinsic sort of consequences, more like deeper consequences for things like 3D CSS. Because if you had like an actual surface, then it would make it quite clear that something's in a surface. Then that means that it sort of is an attribute or a property, a much more intrinsic attribute or property of that object, in the same way that a control panel on like dipping into a table means that it's something that's sort of fundamental to the table, whereas like a screen on top of it would imply a different thing about the relationship between the information and the screen. You could conceivably have an object that simply is resting on top of it, like the way that my phone is on this table here. I wanted to talk about the instrument of writing and of books and book making, not of gambling, but constructing books. Back to what you were talking about, Alan, with regard to hypertext and links and maps and things like that. And is that a tool for constructing?
Oh, no, it's a book that I made, bookmaking.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, that's cool. Something that kind of blew my tiny mind recently, I was, for people who don't just collect information like this, I was just looking back and thinking about the fact that the saxophone was made in the mid-19th century by Adolphus Sax. But also like even the valve trumpet only came about in about the 1830s, which means like, and once you start thinking about how little time that is in culture years, then you start to think about how poorly integrated the trumpet and the saxophone are into the rest of aspects of music. You realize how little time we've had to think about what they're for and what they go with, and how, despite the similarities, the trumpet is the horn is one of the oldest musical instruments we have. We've cut things off animals and then blown through a hole in the end for quite a while now. The sort of the complexities and the realities of a valve trumpet are such that, like, despite the similarity to the things that occurred in the past, and what we do with them now doesn't have all that much to do with them, because the way that we understand how to sort of integrate senses is so much more fragile and superficial than we would expect. And in that same way, the connective technologies and the creative technologies of constructing a book have been centered around, if not monospaced text, then justified text and all of these other forms, such that we simply haven't had particularly manageable reproductive methods for information of the form that you're kind of describing. And that's not to say it's not an excuse, but it is an invitation to go, like, we clearly have not just a little bit more, but much more now, and realizing how hard it is to grapple with even the margins of a problem/opportunity space like that kind of not only entitles but obliges us to consider what we might be able to do with authentic alternatives, and doing things like reading Bob Horn's books and honestly struggling with them sometimes because it is such an illegible form, not by any fault of his, but simply because he's trying something authentically new with it. I think is really interesting and really intriguing to sort of interrogate the form and go like, well, what do we get out of different, and what are we losing as a consequence of the very real fragility of not just ourselves but everybody's lack of capability to learn how to read these things. Like the way that we make sense of a form is, it's so much more fragile and so much more contingent than we would initially assume. Like you sort of naively, I don't speak for you guys, assumes that if you were to come up with a book, like follow a book that is even a little bit different, you know what to do with it, but we don't. But we would get different things out of it. So yeah, I think that the scale of the history, what we have done with what we've done with the form so far have a massive impact. And while it doesn't discount the lack of experimentation, it does explain it and invite us and help hopefully to focus the way we might direct our investigations as a consequence of having that much more at our fingertips today.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Brenda. A couple of other thoughts on that, because it does and also I want to comment on your link about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, because it ties into this. But yeah, wholeheartedly agree. There's so much around us to get distracted by. We're in a state of kind of like a constant modernity, and it's kind of a shift in perspective when you realize how recent the keyboard is, or the saxophone is, or things like that. And even from reading this book a little bit, finally, I realized that, like, there's a syntax to books themselves. That includes a table of contents, includes a glossary index that we're all familiar with. And the focus has for a very long time been on, of course, the content itself, right? But in the 16th century, there was far more focus on the table of contents and on what kind of description should I put around this? What are page numbers? And thinking through that, I realized that a lot of what we call tools for thought now, really should be thought of as a tables of content. They are different kinds of tables of content or context, and they're kind of experiments in these extra appendages that come with books that we've kind of forgotten to think about. We've been thinking so much on the narrative and on what's called the body or the content that we've left these other things hanging. And if you put tools for thought in that context, it actually gives me some relief, because it shows that there's some deep roots to this struggle of, how do we get through a book? How do we think about it? How do we know that we want to invest all this time, right? And now there's like if I think about them as more of tables of content rather than tools for thought, I can add it to this longer list of innovators in the book space. So I totally agree with you there, and that's what I'm excited to see with the shakeup of GPT or larger machine learning, that it might make certain things easier, so that suddenly, like, even standoff properties might not be necessary anymore from a back-end perspective of capturing metadata, but they may become a really cherished front-end tool of an alternate way of experiencing text. So to pivot over to your Alice Adventures in Wonderland, I love what you've done here. At first, when you start skimming, you do the power skim and everything goes crazy, and you're like, whoa, what's this? But then after a few seconds, you start skipping like a frog in a pond, and you can just jump through the paragraphs. I really love it. And it makes me want, a way like it would be wild if you changed your perspective when you're, scrolling, if you got a kind of topology, right? So that like I met Pig and Pepper. If Pig and Pepper sort of raised up not just as larger text, but sort of above or behind, the opening text, and they had a kind of a mountain range effect where maybe every time Alice is mentioned, there's a kind of, could be color, or it could be that there's a particular sort of level that Alice is at. And what would that experience be if you're skimming now,
Yeah.
That'd be pretty wild. Anyway, I love it. So that's all I have to say about those things.
Okay, plenty of things on that. Just came back from Japan. It was very nice. I have my iPhone 14 Pro, which I've already said is quite insane in terms of quality. So even little family moments were captured with that. And even though I have an M1 MacBook Pro with all kinds of RAM and hard drive and whatever, editing it is an absolute dog. It takes so long, parts of it. So that's just really annoying. It's probably the way I've set up the hard drives. I've done something wrong. Doesn't matter. I also have the opportunity to do 360 video, which I didn't do. I did a little bit of LiDAR scanning of dark night Japanese houses, which was nice. So that's when you're talking about mountain ranges and stuff. To currently author rich stuff like that is a lot of work. To build an interactive thing like Brandel has shown us, to make things, it's really, really a lot of work. So I think it's really interesting you bringing it up in terms of our discussion on AI, because I think that is where it's going to be really, really interesting. Because if you look at images created using these prompt things, it's neat, but it's not necessarily what an artist would do. And when it comes to what you're talking about here, there's a very large, full all caps, so what, right? If you can say to a system, go through this corpus, and what I want to see is Lisa on a mountain. What I want to do, you do that. It may not be in the specific artistic style that you first envisioned. Maybe you can prompt change that too, but you have an entirely new way of presenting where so much of that manual labor of the visual stuff is taken away. That is absolutely incredible. I've been so annoyed for so many years, people talking about rich media and, oh, it's so boring with text. The next thing is video. I'm a professional with this stuff. And even for me, it's a lot of work, but that's changing. It's amazing. That's the comment on that. And then there's another thing. In this community, we go all over the place with text, but we have to look at, text for what? And if we're looking at text in academia, there is several very, very distinct things we have to honestly look at. Number one is, what is student text? Student text is there to show that certain criteria for a grade has been met. Really boring, it's really dry, but that is what it is. And there are legal requirements for that. When I did my thesis, I had to look up what do different levels of education in the UK need. And it's really vague, and there's all kinds of issues. And by the way, one thing that's never mentioned is citations. According to the law of education, how it's judged, you don't need to cite anything. That's a culture in academia. Of course, it's important, but it wasn't there. So that's interesting. But what we're talking about, this text, I think in our community, what we're really talking about is half of it is text to think. So it's for yourself. And then when you decide to share it, then it becomes text to get your intent across. But there is that other stream of academic text, which is just to prove something, which is kind of annoying and boring, but got to keep it in mind. That was that.
I have to jump. Fantastic seeing you all again.
Yes, see you on Thursday.
Something that I've done similar to the Alice in Wonderland thing recently. So that's just using CSS to move it around. So it's not the sort of thing that works in, for example, VR. But I took, I don't know if anybody's played, there's a text-based game called A Dark Room. And using TriCast text. I've made that in WebXR so that you have the ability to sort of click buttons and then get a message log and have messages be added to it and fade in and fade out and things like that. It's really exciting, but it makes me realize that the sort of the technical backdrop of all of that stuff is absolutely appropriate for some of those more fine-grained experiments with text and scale, position, zoom, and distortion that Alan was referring to in the context of the Alice in Wonderland body there. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Yeah, that's a really important point that you were saying, Frode, about the different purposes and functions of text. I think that one of the things that I've always been troubled by is the sort of nominal neutrality of text entry and what it is to do things with, and that a lot of people sort of believe that the neutrality of the tool is sacrosanct at this point, because you could be using it for communicating to other people, or you could be using it for sort of sense making for oneself, despite the fact that one rarely uses something, for example, like Apple Notes to write to anybody else, and one rarely uses Microsoft Word to write to oneself. The two functions are relatively distinct in terms of they're manifested a little bit by how reachable the text formatting tools are. The sort of the canonical, typical text formatting tools are present within Notes, but they're actually behind a button click or a keyboard press, whereas they're sort of ever present and in fact pretty difficult to get rid of in Microsoft Word. And so there are sort of implications already in the form of the tools that are initially biased towards that self versus other. But it would be interesting to think a little bit more about taking that further and where the lines are with people's comfort about the different functions. It'd be interesting to think about in Liquid and Author things, whether there are ways of emphasizing the self versus others, or that sort of inner versus outer, and whether there are dualities between the sort of the presentations of the same pieces of writing in order to be able to kind of carry that expectation more explicitly about whether things are for one or the other, or if Author is for one versus the other.
One interesting constraint is the text we're generating now, the transcript of this conversation. And if this whole conversation transcript is put into ChatGPT, it'll say it's too long. So if there was an intermediary tool that could find the long, when we have specific presentations, find the long bits, have those summarized separately, some semi-mechanical to augment the AI. That could also maybe be interesting, because the text for whom, we are a very specific text, and you did a magic blanket a year ago, Brandel. We should be able to do that more easily. So the thing is, yes, I'm all about the future of text, but for me, text is kind of sacred. It's very special. And that doesn't mean it should only all be text. It means text should be used in an interesting and intelligent way. So the whole thing Alan was talking about, a mountain with somebody's name on top or whatever. If you have a system where the text is not a lot of words at all, but the words have more meaning, great. Future text should not be more text.
Yeah, back to AI on that. I mean, my gripe with AI as a tool, and with any tools, in fact, is that the instrumentality of a tool has to be kind of prioritized. The mechanism through which we have an ability to have a fine-grained low latency ability to sculpt the sort of the characteristics and of how that tool is intervening on the task. And we're so far away from that right now, because the sort of the fact of the AI, or the I in the AI, is so far removed from the actual sort of surface of what we're doing with it. You know, you type something and then you get it written back, and that's just absolutely antithetical to the learnable of any instrument that we might have today, be it a valved trumpet or a keyboard or any of those things. You know, I was absolutely thrilled by that that tweet that you linked, Fabian, about the sort of somatosensory integration of the vibratory characteristics of sticks of different lengths, the reality of how learnable those things are in turn, and how they can be integrated into like an acute and fundamental sense of a vibration or an impact at a certain distance along a stick, despite the fact that there's a degree of remove. And that comes from the fact that we have the ability to learn these things from whatever signals we happen to get. And it just falls to tool designers to send out those signals in such a way as we can sense them. But the sort of the obsession with computing, led in part by organizations like the one I work for, is to have clean lines of delineation and separation between the sort of the interface and not the interface, so that people only have this very narrow band to kind of see through and work through. But you know, I think that there's a significant problem with that, and that it ceases to be as learnable. And I think that's important in all forms of interface, but it's never been more important than with what we would characterize today as AI, in that once you have these really comprehensive systems of intervening on the work, then we need to have ways of being able to intervene on that working that carry the dimensionality and the nuance of being able to make it the thing that I want to make. You kind of said, Rhoda, about the AI art prompting systems and how they're neat, but they're not what you want necessarily. And that's the crux of it, is that having what you want, and for that to be sort of not just like I want a cute, you know, cat girl, but that there are these multi-dimensional attributes to the scene, the environment, the sort of the function, the throwbacks to various stylistic kind of influences and things like that. Those all need to be carried through, and it doesn't mean that you need to be painstakingly responsible for every brush stroke, but it does mean that you have to have the ability to kind of imbue it with some level of authorial intent, and unless you're willing to concede that it's not yours, and then, you know, you didn't really want it. So that's what I would bring to AI discussions, is how do we improve, and it's, you know, what I bring to every discussion is like, how do we improve the interface? How do we make sure that the interface is as rich as possible, in order to make sure that as the sort of the capacities of these tools becomes more elaborate, that we still remain in control authorially of what it is we want them to do for us.
You talked about, you know, basically, is there human on the other end? I would interpret partly that. And in one sense, it's very easy to say, who cares if it's an interesting thing if you don't know? However, you jokingly referred to Cam Girl. I'm sure you did it in a relatively benign fashion. But if you look at, not literally, but if you take into account the notion of pornography on the internet, there's a lot of stuff people can download for free, but there is also a thriving industry where you pay someone to take their clothes off live. And I think that is really, really relevant, because what does that say? It says that the actual human matters a lot, even if there is a screen. You know, why are people spending all that money on that when it's available for free, is what an economist might say. So similarly here, when you're talking about this, how can we, I think I'm paraphrasing you, how can we show that there is a human on the other end? And to what degree do we want to do that? Because one of the great things about text is it isn't the same as speech. So let's say someone has a bad accent, speaks the language badly, or has a stutter, or whatever it might be. For them to have less of their personality as it would be face-to-face in text is a benefit. You know, so how do you used authorial, there's also a notion of authenticity, but what is authentic? Is it dressing up in a nice shirt, or is it wearing a t-shirt? Same thing with text. Should you try to write impressively, or should you write your own street slang? I agree with you. These are really important and not obvious questions, but can you elaborate more on where you see AI in that?
So, so I think that if we are to accept AI in this sort of a ChatGPT form, which is implicitly or explicitly agentive, you know, it's presented as though it's an agent, then it means that you know, creation with or through ChatGPT has to be understood as co-creation that's sort of negotiated between agents. And you know, like putting aside arguments about the appropriateness of that ever versus today, I think those are valid things to have. But if we were to put those aside, then you can say, well, what are the ways in which, you know, agents, the ones that we kind of recognizable agents today, successfully co-create? And I went to a concert last night. I went to They Might Be Giants, and you know, seeing the way that these multiple players, these musicians, get up on stage and they participate with each other. There's a tremendous amount of individual and then group rehearsal in terms of what that performance entails. But even in the moment, there's a really rich attentiveness to all of the factors going on up on the stage and out in the audience of what people should do at different times. And those roles shift, and they shift dynamically. So somebody who's got a heavier performance, like musical performance burden in a given track, may spend more time on more sort of mental resources on that and less on the coordinative aspect. But then that can shift and flip relatively fluidly based on, you know, a mutual respect and regard and a genuine interest in kind of being able to respond to the best of their ability to all of the cues together. And I would say that that's absolutely anathema to the nature and the structure of co-creation with any of the agents as they're presented today. So, you know, the most flippant thing. So one of the things I did a few years ago, I think I sort of more threatened to do it than succeeded in doing it so far, is that, you know, I built a keyboard in WebXR. I built some other things that look faintly like they could become agents at some point in the future. They look at your hands, they look at each other, and and so as you play, they might be looking down at your hands, and they might be looking up. One of the things that a ChatGPT of a future could do is, rather than being mediated or prompted through typey text, or even if it was, to have some kind of visual manifestation of attention, so that it had the ability to look at what you were doing, how you were responding to its creation, or to have sort of an oral channel where you were talking to it and gesturing to it, and having the ability to move your hands, and for it to have the ability and the obligation to parse and process the grammar of hand motion, such that those things could be used as sort of programmable aspects. And then to be able to have these, because right now with a ChatGPT, you can start it and you can stop it as it's kind of creating these things, as it's sort of creating making use of various convolutional things in its fancy brain to produce a stream of things. But to our intents and purposes, it appears deterministic. It appears, and that might be actually the truth. But like the moment you press the button to send the prompt away and it's writing, it might be that it's actually all done, and there's an artifice on the other side where they've decided to kind of have this progressive disclosure of that information. And that's, one way or other, like something that I did a few years ago. It's also on CodePen. Is I took the Washington Post printed the transcripts of Trump in the discussion with an Australian prime minister or other, and I transposed those into this kind of progressive disclosure, along with the beeps that go into a Japanese role-playing game kind of thing, where like you have one pitch for Trump and one pitch for the other speaker, and one color, and so then it goes like, and there was really interesting sort of consequence of seeing dialogue unfold and be delivered in that way, because it really emphasized the temporality of it. The fact that we sort of know intuitively that whenever something is literally a dialogue, whenever it's a transcript, then there was a moment when the playhead effectively was here, and this was not said and not known. There's an interesting sort of tension whenever you read watch something with subtitles, and you go ahead of it, because it inevitably serves to deflate some of the tension that might be present as a consequence of very punchily sort of timed kind of utterances. But so back to ChatGPT, I think that one of the things that could be done is expose the realities of what it's doing. So if that's a fiction, then do away with it. If it's a reality, or to the extent that it's a reality, lean into what it is that is as yet ungenerated, and consider what kind of channels and opportunities we might have to intervene on or manipulate the outgoing as it happens. One of the challenges of that, obviously, is that it's antithetical to the notion of unit testing and the singular closure over these things, because it means that there are any number of multidimensional channels that could be changed, and probably would be changed at any time, based on things like the active inference engine that would have to be done over whether I look like I'm happy with your outcome, your output. But those are, I think, are table stakes for making what ChatGPT is kind of asserting it is, by virtue of these sort of environmental cues of the progressive disclosure, its agentic presentation, into something that really deserves that space in our minds, frankly. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, you triggered something. I've been following a guy named David Shapiro and his work around constitutional AI. There are other people doing constitutional AI, but essentially it's what he's advocating for several heuristic imperatives that would be that each input and output would be judged against. There have been other efforts with constitutional AI. I think the most famous one is Anthropic, and they have one heuristic imperative, which is harmlessness. What Shapiro is saying is that you really need to have multiple heuristic imperatives that can at times be at odds with each other. And the ones that he's suggesting and trying to build support for are: one, reduce suffering; two, increase prosperity; and three, increase understanding. So the increase understanding one would be perhaps a filter for getting out the fiction, as one aspect of how a constitutional AI might work in addressing what you were speaking.
Yeah.
On a slight tangent, what that inspired in me is, I don't know if you saw, Brandel, but earlier Fabian showed us, he took a 360 camera around the room and photogrammetry type things, made a a virtual model of that room, which is really, really fascinating. But I've had a thought before about having 2 or maybe 3 cameras, 360 or iPhone or whatever, doesn't matter, in a room. So when they film, they're filming more of a real 3D thing that instantly be put together even on 2D screen. I'm thinking maybe someone who's a trainer could then view that. And if your posture isn't right, they can tell you exactly what's going on. They can't see everything. But in a conversation like ours now, so Fabian and I had this very impressive virtual reality experience with Mark Anderson, and Fabian is just so impressed by it. Oh, okay, you're listening, just checking. Anyway, it was the Horizons workroom. And it, of course, technically, if you look 10 years ago, it's very impressive, but it's basic. It's a bit cartoonish. With the Quest Pro, sorry, my brother just texted. He is in San Diego, so it's good to know that he's okay. You capture the facial expressions, nice, but then how is it presented? Still cartoonish. I'm sure Apple's reality will be blah, 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 amazing, but it's bizarre sitting in front of this 27-inch screen or whatever it is, having you guys at tiny little boxes. So that's part of it. It's easy to capture me. I could invent, and you could all invent easy systems to capture ourselves. But how do we then see the result of that? You know, if you put a headset over your head, then you're back into the whole cartoon generated pixels, which is what the CEO of NVIDIA said anyway. All pixels are going to be generated soon, but it becomes quite artificial. So to have a workspace, whether with text or otherwise, where we can capture more of who we are, our expressions, our environment, if we want to, how do we then see them? I mean, I think both Brandel and Fabian have experimented a bit with projectors. You know, it would be really cool to have a projector behind you guys, where I could see more of you. But I know it's a bit of a tangent, but it's just bugging me. Any thoughts on that?
I think capturing reality, it's really tricky. Like the little Nerf experiment I showed before, it shows one thing, one point of view, and I think we have there was an interesting documentary on Google Earth, not a documentary, actually a fiction on Google Earth, and the more legal debacle behind it. And I think we have this fantasy of being able to capture reality, and I don't think it's possible. We capture I insist a little bit on this because I think as long as we capture something interesting, that's worthwhile, and it's of course relative to our task and our culture and whatnot. But reality, no matter all the different gadgets and techniques I've tried, show me how far we are from everything. It's very basic, let's say. And no matter the amazing progress, it's like being able to go in an Earth and like translate in a volume from just a camera is mind blowing. And yet it shows it's very superficial. It shows very little. So I think it remains a hard problem, capture in general. Worthwhile one, but I don't have answers to it.
Yeah, I would say on a purely concrete material level, in terms of portraying reality in that sort of greater depth that you're asking for, I'm really enamored by the work of folks like Hrvoje Benko. He normally goes by Benko, just Benko. He used to work at Microsoft Research, now works at Meta Reality Labs. I'm not currently considering going there, but he would be the main reason I would ever move somewhere. People like that are just really important in terms of their impact on thinking about what it is that you do. And one of the things that he's done is, if you've ever seen like Microsoft Illumi Room, is the idea of having in your video game sort of set up, your big TV for playing your Xbox game. He was at Microsoft, so of course it was Xbox. But then you have a big wide throw projector that has a much lower resolution that is targeting more or less the same angular range, but it's out like this, so that it has nowhere near the same resolution, but it has the effect of being able to talk about, to sort of characterize the projective or the pixel intervened space as being sort of foveal, the center region being very high fidelity, and this other stuff doing what it's kind of there for. That's the sort of the pattern of all of the work that he did. He also stuck a ring of LEDs around the interior of an iBox inside a VR headset, so that you had the ability to sort of characterize the periphery with a very low fidelity, but in such a way as it gave you that sort of comprehensive sense of sort of horizon and lines, so that if you turned your head, then you would get those views like that. There are challenges with the fact that if you have that lower fidelity, then you end up with some fairly sharp juddering of it. So it's not perfect, but it's a really interesting kind of, I think, response to the realities of what the limits of the human perceptual system are, and catering to those, rather than sort of assuming the worst case of having the same sort of fidelity of pixel display everywhere around you, things like that. To what Fabian was talking about in terms of the difficulty of capturing and representing reality, similar to the photo scan kind of stuff that you were doing. I recently, so we have a couple cats that sort of come in and around before in the past, and we're thinking about how to let them out of the house and into a safe space, because we don't want them running around in the neighborhood. We don't want them risking their lives on the road. And so we've been designing sort of an escape through the house and into the backyard, into a sort of a cloistered area that we would then have the ability to kind of contain. And so I recently got an iPhone 13 Pro that has LiDAR and scanning capabilities and things like that. So I did that scanning and put together the space in the full scale and things like that. And it was really interesting, because take that into Blender, I can actually get all of the dimensions and measurements off it directly. And then if I get, for example, products on IKEA or Amazon, I can either build out the dimensions directly from those specification sheets, or I can download the models of them directly, and then sort of go like, okay, I need this many things. I don't think IKEA sells pigeon spikes, but that's one of the things that we intend to use to scare the cats out of leaping out of the corner of the backyard. And yeah, like that was really cool. But at the same time, it's not, the map is not the territory. It's a very small set of attributes of the dimensionality and the characteristics of that space that are represented, and it doesn't take much sort of interrogation from my daughter to be left with like, no, it doesn't do that. I'm sorry, no, it doesn't have any information like that. You can't see it in that way. It doesn't have that. No, it's just paper thin, infinitesimally sort of represented triangular surfaces with a bunch of pixels on them that may or may not be correct based on the angle. We can't turn the lights on or off. We can't see around that corner. Yeah, just so much that it isn't, and it underscores just how like contingently defined all of those things are for a specific purpose, when we can sort of lull ourselves into a full sense of neutrality and canonicalness of that information.
So two quick things. The first is, it is indeed so superficial, and it's paradoxical that most of us do spend so much time on it, like being photos, being 3D model, nerves, photogravity, whatnot. And it's kind of weird that when we see a recording of it, we want to see it, we want to be in there. But as soon as we're in it, like the thing just disappears, the illusion disappears. It's like it is indeed so flat, superficial. There's nothing yet, but it's still a trace. So that's I think why we still can kick back a memory in a couple of weeks, months, years, decades. I don't know. So it's definitely not worthless. That's why we're kind of counterbalance. I spend a lot of time in it, and yet I'm so critical about it. And then very quickly, I'll share my screen again, and please let me know when you see it. And it's this window that I want to show. Do you see the window with the text scrolling?
Yeah.
Yes.
And do you see my webcam at the same time?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
right.
So now the orientation defines the pace of the scrolling. And you see the number on the top right, so that's how tilted it is. And if I put it flat or vertical, let's say, it doesn't scroll. And if I
Perfect.
put it in the other way, it goes back.
Brilliant.
That's
That was just from the suggestion that Brendel put in the chat. That was not a feature at the beginning of this conversation. And I want to say thank you for this, because that's the kind of discussion that I find especially fruitful when we have back and forth, and then I get like a thing out of it. And I think hopefully that's going to help me think and read. So thanks everyone.
Yeah. No, that's so good. Please describe it as verbosely as possible on Twitter. I think that like getting people to see, because that's instrumentality. You know, that's wielding your phone as a reading instrument in a way that I don't think we have very good reference points for, and it's as evidenced, like not to denigrate your coding skills, but as evidenced by how fast it was to come together from when I showed you the thing. It's not that technically complicated, but it's essential in terms of getting at the core of this notion of instrumentality, of what instruments are and what happens when we have the ability to drive them and perform with them with the level of sophistication that we get with just a butter knife, let alone a trumpet. You know, our tools are not even butter knives, and that's a sorry state. You know, and we have to be able to control ChatGPT with at least a freaking butter knife.
I have to show you something. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, it's really, really brief, but this is a couple of years ago. Let's say, 2013. Can you see this tiny image?
Mm-hmm.
It was an app I had called 3D Pick. This is before LIDAR or anything else. So the whole idea was just you on your camera, you have a little oval shape, and then it asks you click a button and you have to move, like to do let's pretend you're doing a 3D scan of someone, right? So you move just a little bit, but all it does is to create a movie. So when someone views it, if you roll your iPhone to the side, it'll play the movie in this or that direction, starting from the middle. So that means that if it's shot properly, it really feels like it's a 3D image.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
those are fabulous. And QuickTime VR is exactly that. You know, the ability to reconcile what it is that a video frame is, whether it's sort of supposed to be understood to be temporally stable.
Yeah, and it's been used so little. So to see you doing this, Fabian, with text, I would very much like a lazy app, read. If I just slower or faster to go down the page, that makes 100% sense. So it's nice as a antidote to all this advanced stuff, as you said earlier, Fabian. So many more interesting ways we can look at. Edgar's just had a haircut. Let's have a look. Come on, show everyone your haircut. You look amazing. Look at this young man.
Hello.
Edgar, you want to tell everyone you were on the other side of the planet last week?
What?
This little man was in a flight that was 14 and a half hours after a flight that was 2 hours.
And then I took 4 planes.
Yes, you did.
And the bullet train.
And the bullet train, yeah. Okay, we got to go back. We're finishing the meeting. Can you close the door, actually? It's a bit... Can you close... Okay, he's not closing the door. Fine. But anyway, to capture more stuff like that and to use it is really interesting. You know how currently in Reader, arrow key back and forth between pages, up and down is chapters, right? Maybe on an iPad. I'm just having fun with what you've been doing here, Fabian, because I don't have to code, so I can think without coding. Imagine reading on an iPad and doing this, sure, but then also the way you tilt page, or head or section, right?
Yeah.
This is fun. This is useful fun.
Yeah, you could even flick between chapters by doing those. I mean, like there are, or have things where you actually do things with two things, but it means that if you do them with both, it's more. So that if you in the same way that if you roll a ball on a surface, but then you also push the ball, then those two things, while you could consider it redundant, you could also have it just move a lot faster, so that if you are doing a swipe scroll in combination with an angle, then that one changes the inertial properties so that there's no slowdown, but also, so I think that there's some really, man, that's really interesting, isn't it? Like the idea that, so like most of the time when you scroll on a phone today, it has this slowdown here. But if you have it so that it's responsive to the angle, then it simply doesn't. Because the inertial forces are based on the gravity vector, so that if you have it tilted, then it will continue in perpetuity, or even accelerate. Like you can play with it, but I think it's really interesting.
That's interesting.
One of the things we talked about, Brandel, before you joined, and I know we're over time, but this is too exciting, was learning mentally to use even the tools we have now. Like in Japan, we started using Apple Watch to do translations, which was absolutely amazingly high quality. But it's something that took us a week to even think about. But the thing we're talking about now, about different kinds of dimensions of reading, even a tablet, excuse me, Linux people, like an iPad, it does have so many dimensions of possible movements. There is, what happens if you move it away from you? Fast move it towards you. That could actually have interesting effects. It's nice that it's crazy also that we have, okay, hang on, my brain's overloading. In the real world, things have attributes. In the digital world, they have to be given attributes, right? And we can extract them through interactions or metadata and that kind of stuff. So today, these little devices have an insane amount of sensors, like the orientation sensor we talked about, vibration sensors and all of that, but they're just not used. So in terms of the discussion on Thursday, how can they be used in an interesting way to deal with AI?
So as a little counter argument, let's say, a lot of them are used with AI. One of the craze at the moment is large language model, and some of hijacking, let's say, clip and how it's used for, let's say, image generation. But the sensor in there, the camera in the Quest or whatever of your AR, XR devices, it's AI powered. All the how do you say, computer vision for tracking of where the ground is.
Fabian, what I mean is, how can we as end users consciously interact with an AI, not have the AI be a translator? That's what I meant.
I mean, I think what Fabian is saying is still interesting, is that we, like, the AI is what I think you're saying, Fabian, is that AI is fed by a phenomenal amount of sensor data and phenomenal range of forms, that all of those things are being used. But I would also say that the manner in which that's manifested into our current understanding of AI is through this vast bulk collection process, this bulk processing of that data, and then being sort of left with a very thinly presented interface from the trained model as a consequence. And I think that obviously needs to be very different. We need to have the ability to use those sensors. I think that there's just a basic gap in our capacity to imagine those things as sort of constitutive of interface. And I don't know what to do with that other than sort of present alternatives to say, like, here's a way that you can think about these fingers doing this thing or this head doing this thing, given that we know these pieces of information from the position of a Quest headset or the orientation from your Apple AirPods. Because like you can know that. I'm not saying that apps use it. Most of them almost certainly don't. But it's knowable. It has to be knowable for positional audio, spatial audio. But it could be constitutive of an interface of a kind. I think there's a conservatism to the closure over an interface. I bought an Xbox controller and a PlayStation controller recently to sort of test out the extent and the limits of the Safari API for control gamepad. Really, really pleasing to know how much is already there. So I'm really excited by it. But like one of the things that happens in game development is that people want to hit the lowest common denominator. So whenever there's any particular, so the PlayStation controller has a sort of a swipe pad on the top of it, but it doesn't get a lot of use because a lot of people are sort of apprehensive about being reliant on something that's available on a subset of those canonical controllers. And so for the most part, all of the games rely on things that have sort of full mapping and overlap between the Xbox and PlayStation controllers. And that's a challenge. It also masks the fact that people haven't kind of grappled with what the capabilities of these input modalities might actually be and what they might be best at and for. Like I said earlier, I think that we shouldn't underestimate the fragility of our understanding of something based on the exact form it happens to be in at the moment. And so it requires people sort of willfully attempting to break that and really sort of force exploration of those things in order to be able to say, like, actually, maybe the scrolling is awesome. And I think what you've got there, Fabian, is incredible in that regard.
One thing that's just, oh, go ahead, Fred.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to say one thing that just popped into my head as you were speaking, Grendel, was what you were saying was we don't really understand how these sensors are working and how to use them. At least that's how I was taking from it. And I was just imagining an application that would allow you to select one of the sensors, get a visual representation of what it's doing over time, be able to, set triggers and then be able to experiment with it, move your phone around, etc., and then observe what it did. Could be interesting learning tool for using those sensors.
Totally. That you're describing almost exactly my process for discovering a new sensor on a device and being like, okay, so what do I get out of that? What do those things mean? And then how can I start building sort of synthetic characterizations of that input data such that it can be more intrinsically meaningful? So I wrote a word processor many years ago using the Leap Motion with finger data. And in Leap Motion, you get all of the positions of all of your fingers. But that's not easily understandable as a thing. So one of the things that I did is in geometry or in vector algebra, there's this idea of a dot product, which is it's kind of a measure of the angle between 3 points. So you can tell whether they're collinear, which is they're all in a straight line, or if they're at 90 degrees, or whether they're bent past it and things like that. So what I did was, once I got all of those, I created the compound vector dot product of the unit vector from here to here, and then from here to here to here, and then from here to here to here. And then you use those as a single measure of curl. And then that becomes a dimension which is actually approaching usable. So then you can tell when a hand is all straight versus pointing a finger versus 2 fingers versus anything like that, because you have dimensionality of a kind. But it requires that sort of feedback loop of being able to go like, so what's this and how can I understand it? And then how can I drive something on that basis? So yeah, I'd like more people to work like me, I guess is what I'm saying.
A quick quick remark on this and the sensor. And one of the typical thing in XR development is you do a motion, and then instead of doing it again and again, you record that motion. So the position and rotation of your head and your controllers or your hands. And then once you have this little moment in time, this capture, then you replay it and do the interaction again. Otherwise, like putting it on you, etc. But I was thinking, and one of the things I did way back when was for the Vive to play the camera position over time, like as a curve, and then the color change over time. So as it gets newer, it's brighter, and darker if it's older. So you can see the motion over time rather quickly. But what you described, Dev, it made me think we could have this still. It's useful, but with also next to each, let's say, sphere that represent the position of the head, for example, the sensor and the sensor value. So that if there are other things, I don't know, temperature, whatever, and then also represent them either as a curve or whatever else, and then be able to navigate that space, replay it, and then bind them, for example, another item and its rotation, scale, whatever, linked to the sensor. And if you do this in VR, like you freeze time, you have the motion, then you bind them, then you see the evolution of the other item over time too.
Yeah, we need. This is all very good. We need to wrap up, of course, but some kind of a forum for how our devices sense the world, to have an ongoing dialogue with that, would obviously be very, very useful. On the other side of this, an innovation that I think is amazing is when the Apple Watch first stopped being black, when it wasn't red, that it's always showing something, is really night and day. When you see a TV show where the characters have a black Apple Watch, you know when it was made. But also it seems like the device is dead. And now, of course, this is an always on display. And that changes what this device is in really interesting ways. Obviously it dims a bit and all of that stuff, but the messages come up. So I'm just wondering, you're all relatively, well, maybe not you, Fabian, but back in the day we had screensavers, flying toasters and space warps and all kinds of things. Maybe one of the interesting and useful things we could actually do is build a modern screensaver where, the way we work is most of the time we're in front of a live monitor, but there are also going to be monitors that we aren't using. Why not have something useful on them? And if it's a device that's plugged in, that could really give an interesting view. Imagine when you sit down, like in the morning when I wake up, this tells me the weather and stuff, and that's really nice. That it makes it feel like I'm living in the future. But imagine sitting down in front of your workstation, and by default, there is not using a lot of energy, but a little thing saying, this is what your colleagues are doing. This is what the world is doing, but not just as linear texts, as some kind of a visualization, so you get a feel of the day. In a sense, you get a temperature, weather forecast for the day, but based on behaviors or something like that.
Absolutely.
Could you imagine Tim Cook
what are people
introducing a new
mostly-
Mac and saying, and the big thing, it has a screensaver?
For me, it'd be really interesting if I was able to see what the trending conversations were that I'd be particularly interested in each morning, and not have to go to Twitter and all these places to try to figure that out.
Yeah, for me, Bill Buxton has done a really good job of sort of characterizing the difference between a 3-foot interface to a 10-foot interface. 1 meter versus 3 meters away from a computer, and the sort of the modalities that might be appropriate for display and interaction. And one of the things that I bemoan is the total lack of interactivity with the computer that you're 3 meters away from. Where I think that obviously you're not positioned oriented in a way to have fine-grained interaction with it, but like if it knows what you're looking at and whether you're responding to it and things like that, there will be ways of intervening on it for it to be able to kind of present the sort of the characteristics of what it is that you're interested in there, David. And I think that would be really valuable to where, like, if you need to get that more fine-grained interaction, then you can get up closer to it in order to have that more detailed sort of interaction. But if there's information of a kind that can be kind of obtained and observed from a distance, then we should be able to do it from a distance. And I think that, you know, the multiple surfaces that we live our digitally mediated lives on now should start to give us a picture of what kind of surfaces are appropriate for what kind of interactions at what levels of granularity. You have a watch being especially good at being like, no, this is really not for that, but it's good for all of the things that it's good for, you know. And like I say that not as an indictment, but as a celebration of recognizing where very real limits exist as a consequence of some basic human factors, among other things. So yeah, like having the ability to be a little bit more open-ended about where those limits are, and having a sort of a more gradual tailing off of that capability, rather than a hard cut of like, you're not at the keyboard, no computing for you, sorry, you know.
Oh, this is really ridiculous because of the timing, but the very last sentence there, of course, there's a camera at me right now. So I should still be able to do stuff without the keyboard, right? Which has been discussed. But just imagine this, having a screensaver that is a camera into a VR environment. So let's say you have your daily meeting place that Fabian has built, and the screensaver is a camera view of that. Maybe it doesn't update every 60th of a second or whatever. Maybe it's not so much. So you just walk past, you can see is someone there. Or, you know, what are my colleagues working on? When I was in London, as I am now, I had a partner for a project in California, and this is many years ago. During work hours, we just left Skype on in the background, even when we were not talking to each other. Right? So we just had that thing like we're in the same rooms, like, oh, so-and-so. There was no hello, there was no hanging up, there was no ringing, it was constant. So maybe a visual background thing like that, maybe when the machine is out of screensaver mode, it can go into a widget type thing. But so that means that your other work environment is constantly there. These are things that are interesting. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Matt Webb? He worked at an organization called Schulten Webb, and then they rebranded it to BERG, the BERG, British Experimental Rocket Group. Matt Webb's got a mailing, a newsletter, and his most recent thing is called "It's Time to Rethink the Phone Call." Really, really fascinating sort of treatise on what a phone call might be in a context where that we can kind of transport people to spaces and have sort of the ability to consider what might be presented there and how somebody might be able to kind of produce an artifact for asynchronous consumption that still has these performance sort of attributes and characteristics to it. So really exciting. I'll forward it to you, and you'd really enjoy some of the outputs, especially on the basis of that last sort of anecdote.
That would be wonderful. I see Fabian, but just super brief on the rethinking a phone call. In Star Trek, you know, you touch the communicator and you say, Commander LaForge, blah, blah, blah. That is so implementable, right? Because with Siri, we could say, Siri, Brandel, what are you doing now? And what that does is it sends you an audio message that is that. If you choose to reply, it then can open a FaceTime audio discussion. Why the heck are these things not made? Why do you have to click a button to dial someone or expressly say dial someone? It's absolutely ludicrous. Fabian.
Yeah, very brief on the screensaver for the VR room. I think it's a brilliant idea because I've done it. I mean, not, I don't know if you remember.
That is the Frenchest thing that's ever been said. It's brilliant because I've done it.
For now, but I don't know if you remember, I had to update my Remarkable because I got the keyboard, which I don't recommend, but that's for another story. But before this, I don't know if you remember, but I had the image here of a plane, a cabin of a plane at some point. And that image from the cabin was a screenshot from a perspective from the VR space. The idea being that it's the same perspective where I'm sitting when I do this typical interaction. It wasn't social, but yes, there is a version of it before. I did not maintain it up to date, so I can't really say how good it would really be if it was really updated, let's say at the end of each session, for example, or every 10 seconds, 10 minutes, whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good idea. And there is also a French company called La Vitre, and what they sell is a 2-meter screen or 250-meter screen. They don't actually sell the screen; it's just the device for it. And on it, they have like a video streaming software, and you are supposed to have roughly the same setup on the two sides of the screens. You have one at home, or in the office rather, another office, and you have like a carpet. And then if you're not doing the actual call, it's all kind of blurry. And then you can knock on the physical screen. It's going to knock on the other side. It's a little bit like a portal, but it does some of those things that you have a blurry preview of where you're going to go and interact. It's not technically difficult, but the interaction, the usage is actually, it's pretty well done. When it's well done, when the setup is good, it's pretty pleasant.
Yeah, no, yeah, but you're talking about updating, right? So it's not a screenshot from before. You're also talking about the idea of this is the room now-ish.
Right. Well, yeah, now-ish, because it's blurry, and unless you say it's fine to stream live.
I'm looking also at the link that Brandel showed about this 7-foot thing. Horrific. Other than if you're showing someone you bought a new jacket, why would you want to make such an effort to talk to someone? I mean, really cool as a specific use case and test, but one of the great things about this is you can hide part of you. You know, not everybody needs to see that I'm drinking tea and coffee, you know, or standing up. Standing up.
I'm not justifying their tool because it has its, but it's mostly, I think, targeting businesses, and you're supposed to wear pants in the office, so it's a different context that we were.
Oh yeah, apparently
Oh,
that's true. Yes. Right. Okay. I thank you guys for today. And today was nice because we went haywire. We went everywhere as we should. I look forward to Thursday, all of us trying to rein the conversation back to VR and text, repeatedly. And, you know, one thing, please help me, guys. If someone just goes into a big rant about how horrible it is, as long as it's a brief intro, that's okay. But we know there are going to be issues. You know, we only have 2 hours. So how can we employ this power? Is really where we want to focus, right? Not that we're naive technologists, of course we're not, but. Right. Anything else before we wind up?
Because we're completely over time and it's very quick and silly.
Quick and silly we have time for.
I've made a business card. So I laser cut it. And what you might see there is the antenna of the NFC, because now everybody has a phone with NFC reader. I had those NFC tags, little sticker for years, actually 5 years or more, but nobody had the phone to use it. And now everybody, at least in Belgium, taps to pay. And now if I tap to not pay, but I got the URL from the browser, and if I click on it, I go to my metaverse or VR world or WebXR experience. So yeah, little business card that I just show, tap, and don't share.
That's
really
fabulous. Cool. Yeah, that's really cool. By the way, hardly anyone in Japan uses anything but cash, which is bizarre. Super bizarre. Wow. So Brandel, since you're at Apple, do you remember a long time ago, someone had an app that if you tapped the phone, it would exchange contact information?
Uh-huh.
It was just so clever because obviously they're just sharing, they were both bumped at roughly the same time. Why don't you do that for the Apple Watch, please?
For the Apple Watch?
Yeah, so if you tap another Apple Watch, it exchanges contact details.
That's interesting. I guess I'm not familiar with how people share contact details. You could probably do it with the phone too, right? Like, I mean, it sounds like they did do it with the phone. Yeah, yes. Interesting.
By the way, and don't worry, I'm not stripping, but I have a cardiac monitor here I'm going to have for 7 days. And it's because of my stroke and whatnot. But if something specific happens that's stressful or I'm exercising, I can actually add a marker to this for the people reading the ECG later. Do you know how I do that? I double tap it. Right? How bizarre is that? It's come out from our world, kind of the computer double tap, and now it's a normal thing. Double tap your health device. Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, Brendel, just a V card would do. And obviously it knows when it's on a transport thing here in the UK. I'm sure it's the same with you. When I go on the tube, I just do this. So imagine if you did a boom, it would be so cool. And then Fabienne would have to start getting into the locked-in Apple environment as well.
Not yet.
The three of
Waiting
us
for
are
that.
cool.
That's
You
so
are
I
not
can,
cool.
Another phone.
All right. Thanks again. Very, very, yeah, it's so appreciated to see you guys. Okay. Take care till Thursday. Bye.
Yeah,
And then-
I'll see what I can get to on Thursday.
Have a great day.